The final paper today or for this section, is going to be presented by Commandant Lar Joye on armour in the Civil War. Commandant Lar Joye has been the Port Heritage Director at Dublin Port since 2017, and previously he has worked as a curator of Irish military history and as a film archivist. At the National Museum of Ireland, he led a mixed disciplinary team to create the Soldiers and Chiefs exhibition, which covers Irish military history at home and abroad from 1550. He is also a serving officer in the Reserve Defence Forces based at Defence Forces headquarters, and is currently Chief Instructor on the 4th Reserve Defence Forces Standard Officers course at the Infantry School, Military College, DFTC. Ladies and gentlemen, Commandant Lar Joye.
General Officer Commanding, ladies and gentlemen, great to be back lecturing. It's even better to be able to fit into my uniform after 2 years. Many of you will understand where that comes from. In 2016, I gave a lecture here to the Chief of Staff and to members of the General Staff, and when I came up to the podium, I asked the Colonel in charge, "Sir, did you get my presentation last night?" And he said no. And then I had to stand up and talk for 20 minutes off the top of my head. Today, I'm very happy to see that my presentation has arrived, and I'll go through it in a second. To the transport officers and the cavalry officers, as an artillery officer, I want to apologise before I start my lecture. As an outsider to your expertise, this is a general overview of armour and transport during the Civil War, because they're both tied together and work together very much. What I want to cover as we kind of go towards coffee is where the vehicles come from, armoured cars and trucks in the Civil War, transport vehicles in the Civil War, and then also the important role of a commandeer of vehicles, which is a big issue, and it's something that was covered yesterday. In this time of bank robberies, commandeering of equipment, you can understand why many people supported the government forces as they wanted things like their cars and equipment and things that have been taken off them returned. And then there's the reality of the limitations of the equipment. You have to remember that in 1922, not many people drove cars. There's a lack of mechanics and the expertise to use this equipment, and this continuously comes out in all the papers that you read in relation to this. And then the final point to make is that the roads, the road network in Ireland was very, very hard on the equipment, and had been when the British had used these vehicles in 1920 and 21. So those are things to continuously remember when you're looking. And then I look at sources and the conclusion. This just gives you an idea of the vehicles that were handed over to the pro-treaty forces. When we look at armour, it's the main focus is the Rolls-Royce armoured car and the Peerless armoured cars. And when we look at those figures, you have to remember that this is at the end of the Civil War, that we know there were 13 Rolls-Royce and 7 Peerless armoured cars. During the war, at the beginning, we're not fully sure how many cars are around at the time at the beginning of the Civil War, and even as you go on to that campaign from Dublin around the country into August and September. The Lancey armoured trucks are coming from the RIC. They were, I'll talk about later on, were coming from policing operations and were introduced into the RIC in 1921. And then you can see that the Crosley Tender is the most common truck or small truck, and again I'll show talking about that later on, that's in use by the pro-treaty forces. And it's not just those. You can see all the different types. You've also got a large number of Model T vans and cars, but also things like searchlight trucks, which are very important and used by the British forces in Dublin in 1921 for carrying out nighttime raids. The importance of motorcycles, but also simple things like workshop trucks. Probably one of the most iconic one, of course, is the Rolls-Royce armoured car known as the Whippet, based on the 1920 Patron. Again, an amazing machine. It could travel around the country on roads and was used by the British and by the Irish outside Dublin. The Vickers machine gun would have had 3,000 rounds in standard SOP with the British forces, not sure about the pro-treaty forces. And by April 1921, there were 31 of these vehicles in Ireland. By the end of as I mentioned, by the end of the Civil War, we know we're 13. And this is something I think that you notice also with the artillery and with the Air Corps. The British are only handing over enough equipment to help or assist in the Civil War. They're never giving enough equipment that could then later on be used by them. Which I think is something to be aware of. And again, we're very lucky that the Sliabh na Món has survived and has been preserved by the Cavalry Corps, who've done an amazing job over the last 100 years in preserving their collections. And we're kind of owe huge debt to many generations of officers and troopers in the Cavalry Corps for preserving them. The armoured cars and trucks were used by the GOCs in the early part of this war with the artillery. They were known as the freelancers, so it's very much an ad hoc use of them. They're used really to support convoys. They are used operationally, but again, how effective they are, I'm not fully sure. Again, the Armoured Car Corps is created in September 1922, and the Cavalry Corps takes its foundation date from then. The Artillery Corps is founded in 1923 in March. And this era of the freelancers is more centralised control, as you can imagine, once there's a better structure. But the initial days, it's very much, as Tim was talking about, it's this use of firepower with the artillery and very fast and speedy operations that keep things going. These photographs are of the Schlieffen outside the conference that the Society did in 2009 on the War of Independence. And of course, these are photographs taken before it was restored about 10 years ago. But it does give you an idea of, especially on this one, the small scale of it. It really is a very small vehicle with a very large and useful machine gun. When we look at the various numbers and the nicknames that are used, you'll notice that there are 14 numbers, but unlucky 13 isn't used. And again, the kind of Danny Boy and the Schlieffen, which are kind of probably the most famous ones, and the Fighting Second are the kind of the ones that people associate with the Civil War. They're the ones that kind of continuously pop up in the various photographs, and you can see there the Fighting Second on O'Connell Street. During the operations around the forecourse, you would have had the Custom House, the big fella, the Schlieffen, and the Fighting Second. So 4 armoured cars in Dublin at that time. But again, not the 13 that is normally commented in newspapers as being given over to the Free State forces. Here again, after restoration, is Schlieffen firing its Vickers up in the Glen of Amal. And again, you can see a slow profile here in this nice photograph, and you can see it really is a beautiful Rolls Royce with a turret on top and with armour. This is part of the move from Dublin then of Peerless armoured cars, but the Rolls Royce armoured cars down to Cork. This one is taken from Dublin. The steel contraption, if you like, on the right of that photograph is the diving bell, which is now a small museum that I run in Dublin Port, telling the story of the port and the history. And we use this photograph in our exhibition there. So again, it's straight away the artillery and the Rolls-Royce armoured cars are being sent down to Cork to carry out operations there. And again, the point that was being made continuously yesterday, importance of the maritime operations. Captain Lionel McNeill, this photograph is taken in Beggar's Bush just prior to the Civil War. So the Flying Second would appear one of the first vehicles that was handed over prior to the Civil War. The Tom Keogh, of course, is renamed after the Commandant General was killed during the Civil War. Prior to that, this was known as the Danny Boy. Number 4 in this photograph is Lieutenant O'Brien, who was commander of this vehicle throughout the Civil War and fought in Limerick, Cork and Kerry. So it's one of the vehicles that did travel a very large distance during various operations. The other armoured car that's used then is the Peerless armoured car, which is based on an American truck chassis. These were designed during World War I to be handed over by the British to the Russians. Again, the Russian Revolution changes that. It's a lot heavier than Rolls-Royce and can only reach a maximum speed of 18 miles per hour. There have been 70 of these being used by the British Army in Dublin. A large number of photographs of them around Dublin and urban areas. Very, very good on road networks, but useless once you get into the countryside and get bogged down quite a lot. And again, the point I keep emphasising, by the end of the Civil War, we know there are 7. Again, looking at the various accounts, between 2 and 3 Peerless armoured cars are shipped to Cork. How effective, again, they are down the countryside is open to debate. I'm very indebted to Captain Damon O'Hurley, who's president of the Cavalry Corps, who went and took these photographs for me down the Curragh last week. But it kind of gives you an idea of the scale and the size of this. Again, better firepower than the Rolls-Royce, but a lot slower, a lot heavier, and very restricted in what it could do. This is one of the few photographs that we have of the Peerless armoured car in Cork. And again, they were not operationally successful down there. And it does show that by the end of the Civil War, the majority were in Dublin and not being used. This photograph, again, is the Peerlesses a lot later, probably in late 1923 or 1924. The armoured trucks then, this is kind of the basis of the main kind of armour that the Free State does have. It's the most common type of truck in Ireland, armoured truck. It's a 1.5 ton truck. It could carry 8 to 10 policemen, and it had a good speed, so it was nip around the country. However, as Carl Martin has noted, although they were built in Dublin to the same design, no two vehicles were exactly the same. And they were built in Inchicore. So it's a standard Italian truck, a truck that's been around for a while, been bought in large numbers by the British Army, and then up-armoured in Dublin. It was not invincible to attack by the armour. It became very heavy and more liable to break down, and had a very short lifespan. 111, again, this is a debated figure, armoured Lancias were handed over to the Free State Army, and essentially were used, as you've seen the photographs in the previous talk, as personnel carriers, but also for transporting the 18-pound artillery guns. And this one that you see here is in the National Museums of Northern Ireland. It was sent to the RUC and was in use to about 1954, in particular by the specials. And this is the one with a grenade cage on top. So again, an amazing that this one has survived. This one was reconditioned by the RUC in the 1970s. So again, large parts of it are brand new and have been reconstructed. But again, similar to the Rolls-Royce, you get an idea of how small these vehicles are. We're not talking big, powerful machines. They're small enough and tight enough to be in them. Here they're in use, again, acting as shields in this well-known photograph of the bombardment of the forecourts. At this stage, no cage or any cover on top. And even one is used to block in the Mutineer, which is one of the Rolls-Royces that was captured by the anti-treaty forces and was inside the forecourts. And by parking this truck here, they're able to block it from getting out and being used to attack those two guns in any operations there. Again, the Mutineer is damaged very, very quickly and then is taken back and reused by the Free State forces. Here's a damaged Lancia with its front axle completely destroyed on Dame Street. Again, there's a number of photographs from different sides of this damaged truck, but again, we don't know exactly what happened to it or how it became to be damaged in Dame Street. The Hooded Terrors then were an up-arming kind of operation carried out by the Free State forces, which was by putting, and you can see on the right-hand side, steel on top. So the cage, the grenade cage, is taken away, and a steel top is added to the truck to give it some sort of protection from above. So in this photograph that's taken in late 1923, you can see the Rolls-Royces, but over on the right side, you can see the Hooded Terrors as they're nicknamed. Again, turrets aren't added to the top of these vehicles because they would have made them unstable and they would have been very, very unwieldy to drive, but it did give you a bit more protection in driving around the countryside. Again, a limited number were used by the Railway Protection Corps, and turrets were added, but again, because they're on rail, that made them easier to use with the turrets. When we look at anti-treaty forces, again, Ralph Rico believes that the anti-treaty forces had 6 armoured cars during the summer of 1922, and 4 or 5 armoured cars and trucks will be built later in the year. So these are taking civilian trucks in particular and up-arming them. The first capture was by the 3rd Tipperary Brigade on the RIC barracks in Clonmel in February, so a very early part of that kind of period of uncertainty. And we believe 2 Rolls-Royce armoured cars and 2 Lancia armoured trucks were captured, but no one is fully sure where they pop up later on in the roll call of the listings of these vehicles. The Mutineer was captured in May and then used in the forecourts. The Ballynlee is captured up towards Cavan and is used quite successfully by anti-treaty forces against Free State troops, in particular small garrisons, for a number of months until it's captured and its engines destroyed. And the Slieve de Man, which we saw with Michael Collins, of course, was the crew went over to the anti-treaty forces in December, but after 2 or 3 days, it's also captured and it's all over. The River Lee is probably the most famous of the improvised armoured trucks. Sadly, no photographs remain, and it doesn't remain, so we don't know what it looked like. But it is used operationally in August of 1922 in Cork. The one survivor is the Moon Car, which was taken from the Clark family, who owned the Clark Tobacco Company in Cork, and used after the Civil War to attack British soldiers at the treaty ports. So this is an up-armoured car, and then it has 2 firing points for Lewis machine guns at the back. And the last attack that this was used was on the 21st of March 1924, when a small ferry was going over to, I think, Spike Island. And again, various accounts in the papers, between 12, 17, 18 British soldiers are wounded and one is killed during this operation. And it disappears after that. And this was recently donated to the National Museum of Ireland. There you can see the Lewis machine gun at the back with its in its firing position. Still a beautiful car. So we're lucky that one has survived from that era of the anti-treaty forces, but an amazing collection of vehicles, which would be wonderful to see on display in a museum. But again, when you look at the anti-treaty forces, there really are commandeering vehicles. In this case, a small Model T was used to vacate the Dublin Port's ballast office, which at that stage was on a Con Street bridge, was taken over in May and occupied for 6 weeks onto the pleading of the secretary of the company. They left. But it wasn't just the forecourts that was taken over. There's a series of buildings taken over from Easter 1922 up to the beginning of the Civil War throughout the city. And this is the anti-treaty forces actually leaving at that stage, all well equipped. When we look at transport then, the Supply and Transport Corps is set up in October 1924, but traces its origins to a transport established by the fledgling Free State Army in January 1922. In August, the Mechanical Transport Corps took over the RIC Auxiliary Depot, and that's where large amounts of the equipment were, and it allowed them to improve the service that they could provide. In June 1923, there were 2,500 men in the Corps, and Gormastown is very busy with 650 employed there. They had a salvage hangar there which provided spare parts, and having gone to Kew and done research on trying to find files on the handover of the 18-pounders, the files there show that large numbers of vehicles are handed over by the British forces, but a large number of them are already no longer operational and are being handed over as salvage. And this is the wear and tear on the vehicles in 20 and 21. A lot of those vehicles aren't any use anymore, and the British are handing them over for spare parts, and that was what was in the salvage hangar in Gormastown. And again, this just gives you an idea of some of the trucks that were handed over. That one, I think, at Tala. Here we have transport at Beggar's Bush. And again, you can kind of see the importance of cars and vans. The Transport Corps at this stage had its own mascot. The boy Adair, who you may have heard, who was not yet 14, had already been in the army for 14 months, and is a proficient Lewis machine gunner and driver based in the Gormastown camp, who could drive all the vehicles. And when you look at his file, you find that he was from Sligo Town, and according to the official record, he was 15, but he did join the army at that young age, and like many, was discharged then in 1924. This is the Crosley tender. So this one is taken in publicity shot. There's a number of the photographs of this and the officers and crew in the vehicle in and around government buildings in May 1922. Both officers are later on killed during the Civil War. But it kind of gives you the main vehicle that you're going to have seen 100 years ago around Ireland being used by the Free State forces. Confiscated vehicles. On the 14th of December 1922, General Mulcahy in the Dáil, responding to a query from Darrell Figgis about the touring cars, admitted that many of the 285 cars were seized and commandeered during the recent fighting. So these are quite expensive touring cars that would have been commandeered, and also admitted that about 25% of them were off the road for repairs. And there were a large number of letters to General Dalton when he was liaison officer prior to the Civil War from large numbers of companies, businesses around Dublin, even the RIC, where district inspectors had their small cars confiscated off them, and citizens asking for their commandeers back. This is a big issue before the Civil War and right through the Civil War of material just being taken by armed men, and you're never fully sure who you're talking to at these early stages. And again, these are kind of looking at the vehicles around Limerick. They're not using the Lancias, they're using commandeered trucks that are taken from a supplier, Limerick City, and these have been impressed into service in the various battles. So again, it just shows you that it's not always the Lancia trucks being used for the 18-pounders. And in the front, of course, you can see a Rolls-Royce being used to maintain and support the convoys. There are, as I mentioned earlier on, limitations on the equipment. Speed, these vehicles were not fast, and in 1923 the Army's SOPs set speed for heavy lorries at 4 miles per hour in towns and 12 miles in the countryside. For smaller vehicles, they're only a couple more miles faster. So again, nowadays we're used to travelling at speed in cars, not at this stage. Irish roads did untold damage to the vehicles, which were many becoming unserviceable. Looking at the transfer files and queue, as I mentioned, many of the British Army trucks and cars were handed over as scrap to be used for spare parts. And maybe this is kind of part of the argument about how much the state was going to pay for these vehicles when many of them weren't in functioning order. Karl Martin then states in his book that of the 554 Crossley tenders supplied in 1922, only 57 still running in 1926, which again, I would argue is due to the poor quality of the roads, and with 66 in workshops, probably on life support at that stage. And there's a constant lack of qualified drivers and mechanics. And one of the main roles of the team in Gormastown is to train drivers and make sure there is a supply of drivers to keep the equipment going. An interesting photograph of a Rolls Royce having its wheel changed that you can see there, I suspect, in and around Dame Street. In Irish Archives, there are transport reports for the Eastern and Northern Command for a short period, which are fascinating to read. They give a good idea of the challenges faced by the transport officers in keeping everything on the road. Paul V. Walsh, who's a member of the Society, a long-term member of the Society, and I hope is out there watching us today in the US, has reviewed the Eastern Command reports and provides the following information when you break it down. So just taking the 1st Eastern Division, looking at the Lancias, on November the 7th, you have 4 Lancias on charge, but 2 are under repair at that time. So again, with the asterisks, it gives you an idea that a large part of the armoured truck element is not fully serviceable. And these are the challenges that the transport officers are facing to keep everything on track. When we look at sources, there's those 2 wonderful books by Ralph and by Carl on Irish Army vehicles, which you haven't got a copy, I would highly recommend that you get. But also through on Custom Tour, there's special editions on the history of the Cavalry Corps from the 1970s, all freely available on the internet, on the Defence Forces magazine website, and also for Supply and Transport Corps. The On Tolok from 1923 is a fascinating document. Again, it's freely available on Military Archives website, and I would encourage you to go through. It gives you an insight after the fighting of the scale and how big the army had become. Again, that would all change in 1924 when it became quite small. And then you also had a series of wonderful articles in the 1970s and 80s on the history of vehicles in the Defence Forces by Dennis McCarthy, which again are available on the Custom Tour website. When we look at conclusions, as I started off with, the main ones that you associate is that the British were not going to hand over enough equipment to us beyond a large number of rifles and machine guns, that they didn't have the upper hand if they had to come back in. The full knowledge of what vehicles were here and what time they come into, we still don't fully know. And there's probably a need for more research on that part of the history. Again, limitations of our roads. A lot of this equipment was inoperable in a very, very, very short time. So hopefully you've had a crash course on armour and transport in the Civil War, and we can go off and enjoy a bit of coffee. Just like to thank the people helping me put together the talk, and in particular to Dr. Pat McCarthy for asking me to give the talk, and to Dan. And it's been a wonderful conference, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Lar. A great end to a great session to start the morning.